Collier making comments about the CBA. I don't know if she's finally coming to some realization. I don't know. So let's check this out. In the midst of all of it, former MLB executive David Sampson has claimed that the Players Association may have to accept that the WNBA owners have the advantage, and an agreement will only come as a result.
Expansion fees, relocation fees, one-time media bonuses. The WNBA Players Association wants all of that money counted as league revenue when calculating their share, and that's where negotiations are hitting a wall. Here's why that matters. The current proposal from players demands a salary cap of $9.5 million per team. The league countered at $5.65 million. That's a $4 million gap per team. Multiply that across 16 teams and we're talking about a $64 million disagreement every single year. But the players are pointing to expansion fees from new franchises in Golden State, Toronto, and Portland. They're looking at the $2.2 billion media rights deal announced in 2024. They're saying the money exists. The owners are saying something completely different.
The association wants to say to owners, you're having expansion fees, relocation fees, you're getting a one-time signing bonus from your broadcast partners. All of those one-time events are not calculated in terms of viability of a business. I have been saying this for 6 months. You cannot put in expansion fees and relocation fees into the coffers for the WNBA for their money. They're one-time hits. They're one-time monetary hits.
The core of this dispute comes down to one simple but explosive question. What actually counts as basketball revenue? On the surface, both sides agree the league is growing. Attendance is up. Television ratings have improved. Expansion is happening. A major media rights agreement was announced in 2024 worth billions. From the players' perspective, that growth should translate directly into higher salaries and a dramatically increased salary cap. From the owner's perspective, the picture is far more complicated. The WNBA Players Association wants expansion fees, relocation fees, and one-time media bonuses included when calculating league revenue for the purpose of determining the player's share. Those expansion fees are substantial. New franchises in Golden State, Toronto, and Portland reportedly paid large sums just for the right to join the league. The players argue that this is proof of the league's value. If ownership groups are willing to spend that kind of money to buy in, then clearly the business is thriving. In their view, excluding that money from revenue calculations understates how healthy the league really is. But owners see expansion fees differently. They consider them one-time capital injections, not recurring operational revenue. From their standpoint, expansion fees are investments that offset years of prior losses and help fund infrastructure, marketing, and long-term growth. They argue that using those lump sums to permanently raise the salary cap would create obligations that outlast the one-time payments. Once the money is spent, the higher payroll commitments remain. This disagreement becomes even more significant when you look at the salary cap proposals. The players are asking for a cap of $9.5 million per team. The league countered at $5.65 million. That $4 million gap per team doesn't sound astronomical until you multiply it across 16 teams. Suddenly, you're looking at a $64 million annual difference. That is not a minor adjustment. That is a structural shift in how league finances would operate every single year. Then there's the $2.2 billion media rights deal announced in 2024. Players point to that headline number as evidence that the financial landscape has permanently changed. Media money in modern sports is often the biggest revenue driver. If broadcast partners are committing billions, players naturally expect their share to rise accordingly. They believe they help generate that value through increased visibility, star power, and improved competition. Owners, however, may argue that media deals are typically structured over long periods and include revenue sharing, production costs, and other financial complexities. The full value of a deal isn't always immediate profit. Additionally, leagues often reinvest heavily in growth initiatives, marketing campaigns, and arena improvements. From ownership's view, Long-term sustainability matters more than short-term spikes. Ultimately, this standoff is about trust and financial philosophy as much as raw numbers. Players see visible growth and want compensation that reflects it now. Owners see growth too, but they're focused on long-term stability and cost control. If neither side adjusts its definition of revenue or its expectations for sharing it, that $64 million gap could remain the central obstacle standing between compromise and complete stalemate.
By the way, they've already laid out their expansion plans. They're just supposed to keep adding teams every single year just to be able to pay these players? We know that's not how. I mean, the NFL hasn't added a team in how many years? How many years? It's been a long, I mean, we know leagues don't just add teams. All of those one-time events are not calculated in terms of viability of business. And the more players want to tell owners to count relocation fees and expansion fees as part of a going-forward revenue, the more...
At the heart of this dispute is one critical issue: recurring revenue versus one-time payments. That's the fundamental divide in these negotiations, and it explains why tensions are rising so quickly. David Sampson is echoing a point that Mark Cuban made just days earlier. You cannot build a sustainable business model on money that only comes in once. It may look impressive on paper. It may create headlines. But if the revenue isn't consistent year after year, it can't reliably support long-term financial commitments like permanent salary increases. Take the Golden State expansion fee as an example. The ownership group paid $50 million to bring a new franchise into the league. That check arrived in 2024. It provided a significant short-term financial boost. But that money doesn't repeat. It was used to support league operations, infrastructure for the new franchise, marketing campaigns, arena setup costs, and countless other launch expenses. Once it's spent, it's spent. Next season, there's no additional $50 million payment. The season after that, nothing again. Expansion fees are a one-time injection of capital, not an annual revenue stream. Now consider the player's position. If expansion fees are counted as league revenue for the purposes of calculating basketball-related income, that inflates the total revenue pool. A larger revenue pool supports a larger salary cap. And if salaries increase based on that calculation, those higher salaries don't disappear the following year. Players expect to be paid at that elevated level every season. That's where the math becomes difficult. Toronto and Portland also paid substantial expansion fees, roughly another $100 million combined. That's real money. It strengthens the league's financial picture in the short term. But the current expansion plan ends after those teams launch. There aren't additional cities officially lined up. There isn't a guarantee of more expansion checks arriving every few years. Professional sports leagues don't expand indefinitely just to create new revenue. The NFL, for example, hasn't added a team since Houston joined in 2002. That's more than 2 decades without expansion. Growth in established leagues typically comes from recurring streams, national media rights, sponsorships, ticket sales, merchandise, and long-term partnerships, not from continuously selling new franchises. From the ownership perspective, committing to a significantly higher salary cap based on temporary revenue spikes creates long-term risk. Salaries are recurring expenses. They must be paid every year, regardless of whether a new expansion fee arrives. From the player's perspective, however, the league is experiencing visible growth. A $2.2 billion media rights deal signals rising value and increased attention. New franchises in major markets reflect momentum. Players see money entering the system and believe they deserve a greater share of that growth. So the standoff becomes clear. One side views expansion fees and media deals as proof that the financial pie is expanding. The other side separates guaranteed, recurring income from one-time boosts and insists that sustainable budgeting requires caution. Until both sides agree on what counts as true, repeatable revenue, that $64 million annual gap between proposals remains more than just a number. It represents 2 fundamentally different visions of how the league's future should be financed.
So in other words, if the players keep riding that wave of trying to get the league to recognize that as part of their income, the league is absolutely not going to do that. because it is not reoccurring revenue for the league. There's going to be years where there are no expansion fees or relocation fees. In fact, most years.
So if the players keep insisting that one-time payments count as ongoing revenue, Sampson believes negotiations won't just stall, they could completely collapse. Not slow down, not drag on, collapse. And that's a strong word coming from someone who has spent years inside front offices, negotiating labor deals and studying how ownership groups evaluate risk. At the heart of this dispute is a basic business principle: recurring revenue versus one-time cash injections. Owners argue that you cannot promise permanent salary increases based on money that only shows up once. Expansion fees, relocation payments, and special media bonuses may create a temporary boost, but they are not annual income streams. Once that check clears, it's gone. Take the example of Golden State's reported $50 million expansion fee. That money entered the league in 2024. It helped fund startup costs, operational support, marketing, staffing, and arena preparation. But that same $50 million does not reappear in 2025 or 2026. It is not a subscription. It is not a yearly television contract. It is a single transaction. Toronto and Portland reportedly added roughly another $100 million combined in expansion payments. That sounds significant, and it is. But once those teams are established, that expansion cycle ends. There are currently no additional cities lined up with franchise checks ready to be written. Major professional leagues rarely expand continuously. The NFL, for example, hasn't added a franchise since Houston in 2002. Expansion is strategic and rare, not an annual funding mechanism. From the player's perspective, however, the argument is different. They see headline numbers, including the $2.2 billion media rights agreement announced in 2024, and conclude that league growth should immediately translate into higher salaries. They believe the money exists within the ecosystem, and that their share should reflect that growth. A proposed $9.5 million salary cap per team represents what they view as a fair distribution of rising value. The league's counter at $5.65 million per team leaves a gap of about $4 million per franchise. Across 16 teams, that's roughly a $64 million annual disagreement. And that number compounds every year moving forward. Owners are looking at long-term sustainability. Players are looking at present-day valuation. Now there are signs of shifting tone. Nneka Agwamike, president of the Players Association, recently acknowledged that someone will have to fold. That language matters. A few weeks ago, public statements centered on unity and firm demands. Now the word compromise is entering the conversation. There are also broader dynamics at play. Agwamike has been involved in promoting alternative ventures like Unrivaled, a 3-on-3 league concept, while simultaneously negotiating the WNBA's future. That dual role highlights leverage, but it also underscores urgency. If players have outside options, it strengthens their negotiating position. At the same time, the league must ensure financial stability, regardless of external ventures. The calendar adds pressure. The season begins in May. Training camps open in April. Collective bargaining disputes tend to follow a predictable pattern as deadlines approach. Public rhetoric intensifies. Both sides signal confidence. Behind the scenes, however, serious compromise discussions often accelerate as the clock runs down. History shows that most labor negotiations ultimately result in a deal, even after heated public exchanges. But the warning from executives like Sampson reflects genuine concern about structural economics. If permanent salary commitments outpace recurring revenue, long-term viability becomes uncertain. This negotiation is no longer just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It is about defining how the league measures growth, how it shares that growth, and how it balances ambition with sustainability. And with the season rapidly approaching, the margin for miscalculation is shrinking.
Nafisia Collier is saying someone is going to have to fold. Are the players finally getting to the point where they're like, we're getting too close to the season now, things are tightening up, WNBA PA President Nafisia Collier is confident the season will happen, but it won't come without compromise. Quote, well, someone's going to have to fold, aren't they? She told USA Today Sports regarding the ongoing CBA talks while promoting a partnership with Unrivaled. Talking about the WNBA CBA while doing something with the competition Unrivaled.
Mark Cuban's comments didn't just add another opinion to the debate, they shifted the entire tone of negotiations. When someone who recently sold a majority stake in the Dallas Mavericks for billions publicly says the WNBA doesn't currently generate enough revenue to meet player demands, people listen. Cuban isn't guessing. He understands franchise valuations, league balance sheets, and long-term media projections. His message wasn't dismissive of the players. It was financial. At the center of this dispute is a simple but uncomfortable truth. Revenue determines payroll ceilings. The WNBA's new media rights deal, reportedly valued at $2.2 billion over 11 years, represents historic growth for the league. Compared to its previous agreement, it's a major leap forward. But broken down annually, that figure equals roughly $200 million per year. That's meaningful progress. Yet context matters. The NBA's most recent media agreement is worth approximately $76 billion over 11 years. That averages nearly $6.9 billion per season. In other words, the WNBA currently operates at around 3% of the NBA's annual media revenue. Media rights are the backbone of modern professional sports economics. They fund salary caps, luxury taxes, revenue sharing, and long-term investments. When revenue levels differ that dramatically, compensation models naturally diverge as well. Players are reportedly pushing for a structure that increases salary percentages and overall guarantees. From their perspective, that's understandable. Visibility is growing. Attendance numbers are improving. Merchandise sales are climbing. Star power has never been stronger. Momentum feels real, and it is. But momentum is not the same as sustained cash flow. This is where Mark Cuban and former executive David Sampson appear aligned. Their argument is not about fairness in principle. It's about timing. Expansion fees from new franchises, such as the reported $50 million paid by Golden State, and the combined fees from Toronto and Portland, create significant short-term injections of capital. But those payments happen once. They do not repeat annually. Owners cannot responsibly build permanent salary increases on temporary revenue spikes. If players receive raises tied to expansion money, those raises must be paid every season, even when that expansion revenue no longer exists. That's the structural tension. Sustainable leagues rely on recurring income. Media rights, sponsorships, ticket sales, licensing, and long-term partnerships. One-time checks help growth, but they don't stabilize payroll. Meanwhile, public messaging is beginning to shift. Players' Association leadership has started using language like compromise. Deadlines intensify pressure. Training camps open in April. The regular season begins in May. Historically, collective bargaining negotiations often harden publicly before softening privately as timelines shrink. Both sides posture until numbers force realism. None of this suggests the players' goals are unreasonable. Professional athletes deserve a fair share of the value they create. The key question is not whether compensation should rise. It almost certainly will. But how fast it can rise without destabilizing the business model. That's the disconnect Cuban highlighted. The WNBA's growth curve is upward, but it is still early in its acceleration phase. Owners may believe aggressive increases now could limit reinvestment in marketing, facilities, and expansion infrastructure. Players may believe delaying increases undercuts the momentum they're helping generate. Ultimately, this negotiation isn't ideological. It's mathematical. Revenue today sets limits. Revenue tomorrow sets possibilities. The challenge is bridging those two realities without forcing a breakdown that neither side can afford.
No. I see them coming together at around like 7, something like that. I'd have to look at the numbers, but somewhere around $6.5 to $7 million on a salary cap and a little bit more salary. And that's going to be it. It's going to be a wrap at that point, okay? And in fact,
here's how this most likely plays out. And this projection isn't dramatic speculation. It's based on how nearly every major professional sports labor dispute has unfolded over the past 2 decades. There will be a deadline, not a soft target, a real drop-dead date. Sometime in late March or early April, the messaging will shift from ongoing negotiations to the season is in jeopardy. Training camps are scheduled to open in April. Once facilities, travel plans, broadcast windows, and sponsorship activations are affected, the pressure becomes real. That's when urgency replaces posturing, and history shows something consistent. Deals tend to materialize at the brink, within 24 to 48 hours of that deadline. After public statements grow sharper and private conversations grow more serious, a compromise framework will likely emerge. Neither side will present it as surrender. Both will frame it as progress, but it will almost certainly look like the middle ground. If players are asking for a $9.5 million salary cap per team, and the league has countered at $5.65 million, the eventual number probably lands somewhere in the $6.50 to $7 million range. That's not random. It splits the gap in a way that allows both sides to claim partial victory. Players can say they secured a significant raise and meaningful structural progress. The league can say it protected long-term financial sustainability. It won't satisfy the most aggressive voices on either side, but labor deals rarely do. However, there's one element that is far less likely to bend: the classification of expansion and relocation fees as recurring revenue. From an ownership standpoint, that's a structural red line. If expansion fees are treated as ongoing basketball revenue for salary calculations, it sets a precedent that fundamentally changes financial modeling. Those payments are one-time capital events. Once they're distributed or reinvested, they don't regenerate the following season. If salaries are permanently raised based on those temporary inflows, the league faces 2 difficult long-term outcomes. Either it must keep expanding indefinitely to create fresh revenue injections, which is unrealistic, or it must later reduce payroll when expansion slows, which would create another labor crisis. Professional leagues do not expand endlessly. Markets eventually saturate. Infrastructure stabilizes. Once that phase ends, revenue must stand on recurring streams: media rights, sponsorships, ticket sales, merchandise, and partnerships. That's why owners are unlikely to concede on counting expansion fees as repeatable income. It creates future obligations without future guarantees. So the most probable outcome looks like this: increased salaries, a higher salary cap than the league initially offered, enhanced benefits, maybe improved revenue-sharing mechanisms tied specifically to recurring media growth, but no structural redefinition of one-time expansion money. Both sides will claim progress. Both sides will say they stood firm. And privately, both will know the deal was forged under deadline pressure. Because in modern sports labor history, brinkmanship is common. Total collapse is rare. The clock creates clarity. The real question isn't whether a deal will happen. It's how close to the edge both sides are willing to walk before they finally sign it.
these players need to hear it. Because obviously, I don't know. A lot of shit's not sinking in with this bunch. Not the sharpest tools in the shit. I'm just pointing that out. And they're going to do something. The players are going to do something radical so it looks good on social media. And then they're going to sign the deal. Tell me.
And that brings us back to David Sampson's warning. He isn't rooting for negotiations to fall apart. He's not attacking the players or dismissing their value. What he's doing is explaining how ownership groups typically operate when real money and long-term risk are involved. When you've collectively absorbed hundreds of millions of dollars in losses over nearly 3 decades, and you're finally beginning to see a realistic path toward profitability, you become extremely cautious about locking yourself into financial structures that could drag you backward. The WNBA has been subsidized by the NBA since its launch in 1997. That's not a secret. It was always framed as a long-term investment, one built on patience, brand development, and gradual audience growth. Team owners understood they weren't buying into an immediate cash machine. They were investing in potential. Losses were tolerated because they were seen as the cost of building something meaningful and sustainable. But the key word there is sustainable. Sustainability eventually requires profitability. At some point, a league has to generate enough recurring revenue to support itself. And you don't reach that point by committing to permanent labor costs based on temporary spikes in income. That's the central tension. Players, led by union leadership, argue that what they're asking for is fair. NECA Aguamike has said that if they didn't believe their demands were justified, they wouldn't be making them. From a human perspective, that makes sense. Players see the growth. They see sold-out arenas. They see national television numbers climbing. They see the buzz around rookies like Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese bringing entirely new audiences into the sport. They see a $2.2 billion media rights agreement. They see expansion franchises paying tens of millions to join the league. From that vantage point, it feels like the value has arrived. But fairness in labor negotiations isn't determined by emotion or momentum. It's determined by what the business can support right now, not what it might support 5 or 10 years from now. Yes, the media deal was a major step forward. Yes, attendance jumped dramatically in 2024. Yes, merchandise sales are rising. All of that signals progress. But progress doesn't mean you've reached financial maturity. It means you're climbing toward it. Trying to impose the economic structure of a fully matured, massively profitable league onto one that is still building its revenue base can destabilize the entire operation. That's not pessimism. That's business math. Here's the uncomfortable reality players must consider. Ownership has leverage. Significant leverage. Owners can shut down operations temporarily. They can absorb short-term losses. They have diversified portfolios, alternative revenue streams, and deep capital reserves. If there's a work stoppage for a few months, it hurts, but it doesn't threaten their livelihoods. For many players, that's not the case. The average salary in the league remains well below what athletes in larger leagues earn. Missing paychecks for an extended period creates real financial strain. That isn't a moral judgment. It isn't about who deserves more. It's about negotiating power. In labor disputes, the side that can endure financial pain longer usually holds the upper hand. Billionaire owners can endure more pain than players earning between $70,000 and $200,000 per year. That's simply how capital works. Samson understands that dynamic. Mark Cuban understands it. Virtually every executive who has participated in collective bargaining negotiations understands it. And now, based on recent comments from union leadership, it appears the Players Association may be acknowledging it as well. When language shifts from absolute demands to discussions of compromise, that's a signal. It suggests that the rhetoric is evolving toward realism. Publicly, there may still be strong statements. There could be coordinated campaigns, social media pushes about being undervalued, or even threats of a strike. That's part of modern negotiation strategy. It energizes the fan base. It frames the narrative. It creates public pressure. But historically, the real agreements are forged quietly. They're negotiated in conference rooms with financial advisors, attorneys, accountants, and league officials analyzing spreadsheets line by line. They examine projected revenue curves, cost structures, and risk exposure. They debate percentages, guarantees, escalators, and triggers tied specifically to recurring income, not one-time payments. That's where the final numbers will come from. If history is any guide, a deal will likely emerge just before a critical deadline, probably in late March. Training camps are scheduled for April. The regular season is set to begin in May. Television contracts, sponsorship commitments, and ticket sales depend on clarity. Deadlines force decisions. When the agreement becomes public, it will probably feature a salary cap somewhere in the $6.50 to $7 million range per team. That figure represents a midpoint between the players' reported demand of $9.5 million and the league's counteroffer of $5.65 million. It gives players a meaningful raise. It preserves some long-term flexibility for the league. And almost certainly, it will not redefine expansion or relocation fees as recurring revenue. That line is too consequential for ownership to cross. If one-time expansion payments become the foundation for permanent salary increases, the league would either need perpetual expansion, which is unrealistic, or it would eventually face payroll obligations that outpace steady income. That leads to cuts, retrenchment, or another labor dispute down the road. Professional leagues rarely expand continuously. Markets eventually stabilize. Growth shifts from expansion fees to media, sponsorship, and ticket revenue. Sustainable payroll models must be built on those recurring streams. When the final deal is signed, both sides will claim progress. Players will emphasize gains in salary and benefits. Owners will emphasize fiscal responsibility and long-term viability. Neither side will present it as a concession, but both will have compromised. And when that moment arrives, it will be worth remembering that multiple experienced executives predicted exactly that outcome. Not because they oppose players, but because they understand the structural economics of professional sports. The WNBA is undeniably growing. The 2024 season proved that. The attention is real. The cultural momentum is real. The commercial opportunity is real. But growth phases require discipline. Trying to fast forward to the financial structure of a league generating billions annually, when you're still building toward that threshold, risks undermining the very progress that's been made. Momentum can be fragile. Overextending financially during a developmental phase can stall expansion rather than accelerate it. This negotiation isn't about whether players deserve better compensation. They do. It's about timing, structure, and sustainability. It's about aligning payroll growth with reliable, repeatable revenue. The path forward likely includes meaningful raises, improved benefits, and a stronger revenue-sharing framework tied specifically to media growth and long-term expansion of the fan base. It probably does not include dramatic, immediate restructuring based on temporary cash infusions. The final salary cap number will tell the story. If it lands closer to $7 million, that signals compromise. If it somehow reaches $9 million, that would represent a major shift in ownership philosophy. If talks collapse entirely, it would mark one of the rare modern cases where brinkmanship didn't resolve at the deadline. But based on decades of sports labor history, collapse is unlikely. Compromise under pressure is far more common. The larger question is strategic. Do players gain more by holding firm and risking a season, or by securing steady gains now and positioning themselves for even stronger leverage when recurring revenue grows further? Because in labor economics, leverage increases when the underlying business strengthens. And the WNBA's trajectory suggests strengthening, just not full maturity yet. The league stands at a critical juncture. It can build carefully on its breakthrough season, aligning costs with growth and maintaining momentum, or it can overextend in pursuit of immediate parity, with leagues operating at vastly different revenue levels. What happens next will shape not just the 2025 season, but the long-term structure of women's professional basketball in North America. So what do you think the final salary cap number will be? Will it settle in the mid-6 million range? Closer to 7? Or do you believe players should hold firm, even if it risks delaying the season? Every negotiation eventually reaches a moment where optimism meets arithmetic. We're approaching that moment now.